There's a fine line between a game that's a frustrating mess and a game that's an addicting quest towards mastery. Games like Hotline Miami, Celeste, and Dark Souls can often take you dozens of tries to get through a level. And yeah, sometimes these games make you want to throw your keyboard out the window, but something about them keeps you coming back again and again and again. What's this secret sauce that keeps players hooked even when a game is relentlessly pushing the player to their limits? Over the past month, I sought to answer this question with my own game, Bloodthief. I ran a playtest with my Discord, and while the initial feedback was discouraging, after dozens of hours of testing, observing, and iterating, I think I'm starting to hone in on that secret sauce. In this devlog, I'm going to cover all the things I did to take my little demo from something players rage quit after 10 minutes into something that playtesters are already spending hours and hours trying to master. Alright, let's dive right in. If there's one thing I've learned lurking through the depths of the YouTube and Reddit game dev scene, it's that you can't make a good game without playtesting. Last devlog I did a tiny 3-person playtest with some of my best friends. But the truth is, my friends are nice guys, and they care way too much about my feelings. That's where my Discord comes in. I wanted to extract as much information out of this broader playtest as possible, so I prepared a brief Google form that playtesters could use to fill out and give feedback. I also wanted to get slightly more sophisticated, and I set up some basic analytics for the game. For analytics, I needed a way to track things like how many times did it take for the player to beat a level, and how many players that beat the first level decided to move on to the next level. The leading brand for this type of thing is gameanalytics.com, but I immediately threw that option in the trash as soon as I found out that I needed to compile Godot myself to use their plugin. Nope, way too lazy for that. I tried the next best thing, which is a service called quiver.dev. Setting up Quiver with my game was pretty easy. I literally just made a free account, enabled the plugin in my game, and started adding events like this one here, and boom, analytics was in the dashboard instantly. Pretty sweet. For the record, I'm not sponsored and I have no affiliation with Quiver, I just think it's a cool little service. So now that I had my level ready, my survey set up, and analytics enabled, it was time for me to distribute my game to playtesters. Steam is a slick feature called Steam Playtest that allows you to easily distribute early builds of your game. It's kind of like one step before a demo, which I really like. So I hit publish on the Steam Playtest, notified the playtesters, and everything went perfectly. The game was fun, the players loved it, and in the eyes of my Discord, I was elevated to the status of a god. Just kidding, the game sucked. In those first few hours of that playtest, I quickly learned a valuable lesson. Anyone can make a hard game. The hard part is in getting the player to care enough to spend their valuable time learning how to master it. And the harder a game is, the more likely the player is to just get up and do something that takes less effort. And yeah, looking at the initial play stats, I think I permanently lost some folks. Look at how many people just played my game for 10 minutes and never picked it up again. So I'm personally pretty good at my game. I've gotten pretty good at all the mechanics and I can fly through all these levels. So when I saw these stats, I was like,
be better, be better, be better, be better.
But then I watched some of the playtest footage. Okay, I think I made this part a little too hard. I can literally feel this guy's rage through the screen. And yeah, a lot of these clips just culminated in people hitting the quit button and probably never playing again. This was not a unique story. I got dozens of comments from playtesters saying that the mechanics felt jank, the tutorial just wasn't clear, and overall the game was just too hard. And the data spoke for itself. Look at this guy who died 209 times in the tutorial. So yeah, at this point it was starting to look like I had accidentally made the most frustrating game in history, and it was time that I put my pride aside and make some changes. I took some time to consult with some of my favorite game dev resources, and through my research, here's what I found needed to be changed. All the best games have this quality, but I definitely underestimated how hard this part was going to be. For example, wall running was one of the mechanics I got the most negative feedback, which sucked because it's one of my favorite mechanics in the game. One where, if you master it, you can use it to go at stupidly fast speeds, save yourself in tricky situations, and even fully skip certain parts of the map. But all this coolness was completely lost on so many players. Players thought it felt janky, made no sense, was awkward to use, and for the most part, it just kind of sucked. And the recurring theme among all this feedback was that it just wasn't intuitive. It didn't seem to be clicking for a lot of players how wall jump worked. Some folks knew how it worked and still thought it sucked. So how did it work? Well, to wall jump, you had to lean into a wall while in the air, then while leaning, press spacebar to jump. So if you have a wall on your left side, while in the air, you have to be holding A, then press spacebar to actually execute the jump. When I first designed this mechanic, I really didn't think that this was that hard for the player to do. But after going through hours of playtest footage, it became clear to me that this mechanic is very problematic in two ways. The first way is that there's no indicator telling the player that they actually are wall running and can now perform a wall jump. Like right now, I'm kind of close to a wall, but I'm not actually eligible for a wall jump just yet, because technically I'm not touching the wall. It's just really difficult for the player to see this, and it leads to the player thinking that the mechanic is just buggy. There'll be situations where the player feels like sometimes the wall jump works and sometimes it doesn't, and they don't know why. The other issue was just that the wall jump itself was just too hard to execute. When I made the mechanic, I thought that having the player learn to press two buttons at the same time was not going to be a problem. But what I didn't factor in was that wall running and jumping is a fundamental mechanic, one that the player has to learn right away and is intertwined with every other mechanic in the game. It's like if every single mechanic in Mario 64 was predicated on you learning the side flip. That would just be too much to ask the player. I think my new rule of thumb is that fundamental mechanics like this should only require one button press. So I ended up fixing these issues with two key changes. When you're in the air and you're close to a wall, the player is automatically going to enter the wall running state. I made it so when you're wall running, the player camera leans to the side slightly, you fall towards the ground slower, and you can hear your feet running on the wall. It's all very subtle, but all these things combined do a lot to let your subconscious know that you're wall running. There's a term in game development called diegetic indicators, which are basically indicators that provide the player with information about the game without taking them away from the immersive experience. For example, if I just added a little running guy at the bottom of the screen every time you were wall running, that would be very not diegetic. I would say as a rule of thumb, if some information can be delivered to the player diegetically, that is almost always preferred. The other way I improved wall running was just by simplifying the controls. I made it so you no longer have to be leaning into the wall to jump off the wall. As long as you're in the air and near a wall, you're wall running, and as long as you're wall running, you can press space to vault off it. These changes were a huge hit for the playtesters, and the feedback was unanimously in favor of the new wall running. The part I like the most about these changes is that it doesn't really buff anything. I didn't make the game easier really at all, and wall jumping still has an extremely high skill ceiling that is quite difficult to master. So I think the key takeaway here is that unintuitive gameplay is not a replacement for challenging gameplay, and you should always strive to make your game as intuitive as possible. There were a few other rage quitty parts of the playtest. The biggest offender was this part of the tutorial right here. The goal here was to teach the player about another core mechanic of the game, the slide jump. With slide jumping, you can land your jumps directly into another slide, thus preserving all your momentum. This mechanic allows you to move at super speed, zoom across the map, and it opens up all sorts of cool platforming challenges. But in reality, slide jumping for most players looked like this. The problem was, there's a pretty unforgiving window where the slide jump actually works. You have to trigger your slide right when you hit the ground, otherwise it's not going to work. I made this more forgiving by making it so as long as you're holding the slide button while you're in the air at all, you will go directly into a slide, thus getting rid of any timing element in this mechanic. In the case for my game, I'd say getting rid of the timing is totally fine, because that's not the type of game I'm trying to make. If I was making a rhythm game or something like that, timing button presses would feel very important. But I'm trying to make a game where the player goes fast and uses momentum to get through obstacles and defeat enemies. And adding this mechanic where you have to perfectly time a button click to keep your speed feels like it only gets in the way of that core gameplay. One other scenario I saw in playtesting was this. Or this. This kind of thing showed up in the player feedback a lot. The player feeling like their hands were tied while they were in the air. Initially, I had actually designed for this. Since this is a momentum-focused game, I thought back to games like Portal, where you're building up this momentum and your air control is very little. The way you get through the levels is through strategically planning your route and executing. But unlike Portal, Bloodthief has way more platforming. and you're constantly moving so fast in Bloodthief. So what this leads to is situations where the tiniest mistakes in misaligning a jump usually leads to your death with no chance of recovery. The solution to this one was super simple, just give the player more air control. I like this because it lets the player remain in control no matter what state they're in. And yeah, it makes the game easier for now, but as the game progresses, I can still make the game more difficult by doing simple things like making platforms smaller or spacing them out further. Sometimes air control still isn't enough, like in situations like this. And this can feel pretty shitty if you've just had a perfect run up to this point and there was literally nothing you could have done about it. So I added the ability to parry arrows by right-clicking. Now, if you see an arrow coming your way, you can redirect the arrow back at the enemy with a well-timed parry in a very ultra kill-like fashion. I think this mechanic adds a lot to the game in a lot of ways. It prevents this scenario where the player is just screwed if they get shot while they're flying through the air. Now, if a player gets hit, they only have themselves to blame because parrying is always an option. It also creates an interesting decision for the player, like in this scenario, where you can parry the arrow, or if your air dash is all the way charged up, you can dash at the enemy instead. Lastly, it adds back that timing thing that I took away from the slide jump. For players that like mastering timing-based mechanics, this gives them an additional option to play around with. Players that would rather go fast and strategically dodge arrows can do that instead. Supporting different playstyles always feels like a good thing. There are a lot of opinions online about how much you should punish the player for losing. This came up a lot in my playtest, where some playtesters wanted more frequent checkpoints, so dying didn't feel like such a terrible failure and you could progress through a level more piecewise. This is an area where I'm not really budging that much. I hate it when I'm going through a boss battle in a game only to die and get respawned in the middle of the boss. I feel like doing stuff like this robs me of that triumphant feeling of getting good and accomplishing something difficult. Maybe my favorite gaming moment of all time was when I defeated the Rebel flagship on hard mode in FTL. That moment was special because all of the work and anticipation that led up to it, because of the punishing nature of the game. If every time I died I got to just start right back up to the beginning of the battle, that moment would have just been another middle-of-the-road gaming moment for me. Now, FTL is a roguelike, so it's a bit easier to tell the player you have to start all the way over, since they can completely change their approach and have an entirely fresh gameplay experience the next time through. All this to say, I think there's a middle ground. My game's a bit more linear than FTL, so I'm definitely going to have some checkpoints. I'm just holding my ground for now that some punishment can be a good thing. So those are the main gameplay changes that I made, along with dozens of little bug fixes that playtesters found. And the player experience is night and day from where it started. Median playtime is way up, and there's already a solid amount of players playing for an hour or more. A mini speedrunning community is even starting to develop. There's already some people that have crushed my best time, and it's so awesome seeing people come up with crazy tactics that I never thought of to shave time off their run. It's all just so exciting and makes me want to go make some more stuff for people to play. So here are the main takeaways. You need clear indicators to the player as to what is happening in the game, like when you can wall jump. Gameplay should be as intuitive as possible. Early levels should not require perfection. Give the player room to learn the basics. Make sure the player always feels in control, and be cognizant of how punishing your game is and cater to your target audience. So what's next? First of all, I'm constantly updating the game and pushing new updates to Steam. Go try the most recent playtest and let me know what you think. It's free to play and you can play it on Steam just by going to the Steam page and clicking this button here. Feel free to give Bloodthief a wishlist too while you're there. I'll put a link in the description to link you directly to the page. Right now, I'm working on a ton of new content, new levels, new enemies, and some crazy new mechanics. They're not ready for prime time just yet, but join the Discord and you'll be the first to know about them. Alright, that's all for this devlog. Do me a huge favor, wishlist Bloodthief on Steam, go play the playtest, and have a great day.